Hello and welcome to another Plane Truce, and this week we're going to be talking about pilot and crew hours. Joining me as always is your friend, my friend, it is the legend that is Captain Al. Hi Captain Al.
Hello there, how are you doing?
I'm very good, thank you, I'm very good. And now this is such a big subject, so I appreciate we're only going to be skimming the top of this, but obviously, as many of the listeners will know, I am a coach driver when I'm not doing this, and obviously the same for me as well as HGV drivers is that we're governed by very strict rules and regulations about how long we're allowed to drive for, how long our duty is allowed to be, etc. And it suddenly occurred to me, I presume obviously that pilots have similar restrictions in place.
Very much so. Very heavily regulated and very complex in nature.
Right. Okay.
So as a coach driver,
yep.
I'm going to guess that you could basically, from the top of your head, reel off the basic rule structure as to how many hours that you can work in a given day.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are certain changes depending on factors and things, but very minor. But essentially, yes, it is more or less exactly the same.
So could we write out the basics of your driving time limitations on one sheet of A4?
In fact, actually, I have a crib sheet that's on a double-sided sheet of A5. So
okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So for pilots and cabin crew, it goes into approximately 25 pages of A4.
25 pages?
Yep, it's a whole chapter of Ops Manual A. It's chapter 7 for anybody who wants to look it up. And there is a lot in there. So one of the areas that most people look at is how many hours can a pilot be flying the aeroplane? Now, this is complicated because it all depends on whether you are acclimatized to the time zone that you are in, yes or no, what time of day you're starting, because that has a factor on alertness, how many sectors you're doing, because the more sectors that you do in a day, the more tiring it is. So one very small part of this huge chapter is a table. There are two tables, one for acclimatized, one for non-acclimatized. And by acclimatized means that you have been in the time zone that you're operating for a sufficient period of time to become acclimatized. You're not subject to the rigors of jet lag, if you like.
Right.
So you'll go into the table with the start of your duty time, and there are about 13 or 14 time zones, if you like. I'm not talking about time zones like here in LA. I'm talking about the starting time zone. So there's a little block from sort of 6 in the morning till lunchtime, and then the day is split up progressively. So you'll go in at that point and the number of sectors that you're going to do, and you'll come up with a time. And it could be anything between sort of, broadly speaking, 9 and a bit hours up to 13 hours. So that bit is relatively straightforward, but there are lots of other aspects that you can throw into the equation. At the planning stage, you can be planned to do an extra hour over that table if you've been given a bit of extra rest beforehand, and you'll have a little bit of extra rest after. And then there's also something called commander's discretion, which is the ability for the commander to decide to extend those limits by a time period as he or she feels fit to do so. So that basically covers the simple bits of it. Sat over the top of that, for the time being, are the European Union Working Time Directives, which kind of suggests that the longest that anybody should be working in a working day is 16 hours. So typically 16 hours would be the longest day that you would be on duty as a pilot, although that wouldn't be 16 hours of actually flying the aeroplane. And then if we really want to throw into the equation for our long-haul operations, then of course there is time where you'd be away from the controls, asleep in a bunk or in a seat in the cabin, and that extends the amount of duty that you can do. So it is a complex subject that I cannot particularly summarize in detail without getting into the real nitty-gritty. So that all applies for pilots. What about cabin crew? Well, yeah, they're humans too.
The rumours are true then.
They are true. And we'll put it reasonably simple in the majority of cases. They can work an hour extra over the pilots.
Right.
So,
do you know the reason behind that?
it's more to do really with the fact that typically the requirement for absolute concentration at the latter stages of the flight is a little less. That's not to say that the cabin crew aren't alert and poised and ready to kick into action if necessary, but that's obviously in the minority of cases, whereas for us, we need to be on top of the arousal curve at the last part of the duty to land the aeroplane.
Right, okay.
Also, from an administrational point of view, you can see the difficulties if the cabin crew went out of hours before the pilots. What are you going to do?
Right. Yes, there is that, yeah. Now, I mean, obviously, on some of the longer sectors, I know that pilots can have a rest period during the flight. Now, are they allowed to have that in the cockpit, or do they need to go to a specific rest area in order to, like, not be there? Essentially, if you're having your rest period in the cockpit, there is that argument, are you officially off duty?
Wouldn't you love a simple answer to that question?
I would, yes, but I'm not going to get one, am I?
No, because your simple question produces about 4 or 5 avenues that we can discuss.
Okay.
So let's look at a simple longish flight, a sort of flight from the UK down to Turkey, so 4 hours or so, 5 hours. You're going to do there and back in a day. There are going to be periods of time in the cruise phase where the workload isn't particularly high, and therefore it is perfectly acceptable for one crew member at a time. I'm talking about the pilots here, because typically this will be 2 pilots.
Yeah.
For one pilot at a time to take what is called controlled rest. In simple terms, a cat nap. So a quick sort of power nap of no more than 30 minutes. The scientists have studied this at great lengths, and the rejuvenating effects of a cat nap are well documented. So rather than try to sort of eke it out a little bit, so those of us who've done long car journeys and we're just like, I'll be okay. Actually, the better thing to do is pull into the services, have a 20-minute nap, and you'll be much safer than, winding down the window, putting the radio on, taking the 17th coffee, that sort of thing.
Which in my experience has never worked. It's already too late once you've reached that point, in my experience.
Yeah. So a quick power nap, and there are very set procedures with regards to how that's administered so that you don't both end up sleeping at the same time, etc. Right. So that's controlled rest, and that doesn't affect how many hours that you can do. Then for longer haul operations, they might put a third pilot on the flight deck. It's just basically an extra set of eyes. They're not going to operate the controls particularly, and you can get a small extension to the maximum permitted flight time by just having an extra pair of eyes on the flight deck. Then you get into a different avenue, which is where that third pilot will actually do a stint of flying the aeroplane. So one of the pilots is actually then officially resting. So they are not operating the aircraft. They're still on duty, but they have gone to either a quiet seat in the cabin that is dedicated for the crew member only. It's not a case of just trying to find an empty seat, sitting down next to Bob and Vera and having a nap. It will be a sectioned off seat. Or in an aircraft designed for long-haul operations, there will be crew bunks. Yes. So actually sort of proper sort of beds, if you like. Yeah. You go and tuck yourself away there, and that will extend your number of hours that you can operate, because you're actually properly resting. You're away from the flight deck.
And presumably this is the same for cabin crew as well, because I know on a long-haul flight they're expected to take a break.
Yep, absolutely.
And again, I mean, I've seen pictures of a crew rest area. I mean, it all looks very first classy, if I'm honest with you. They've all got their own little TVs absolutely. And their nice little bunks, and there's somewhere where you can draw the curtain and literally stretch out and sort of shut your eyes for a little while. I don't know how well one would sleep perhaps.
Yeah, I think it's probably fair to say for the cabin crew, it's a little bit more communal, whereas for the pilots, it's a little bit more intimate.
Okay.
But yeah, that's absolutely correct. And again, it may well be for the cabin crew that they will take their rest in allocated seats in the cabin if there aren't bunks on that particular aircraft.
Okay. Yeah.
And then you mentioned the ultra long haul flights, your sort of UK down to Australia non-stop that are happening a little bit more these days, especially with lighter passenger loads.
Yeah.
They will have for the pilots 2 entirely separate crews because there comes a point where the aeroplane can fly longer than the people can operate it. So you'll just have a crew that does the takeoff and a crew that does the landing, and they kind of just swap over halfway through. So yeah, it can turn into a little bit of a game of musical chairs as you rotate around. And I've certainly done that in the past at Monarch when we used to do long overnight flights down to the Maldives. We'd have 3 pilots, and quite often it would be that sort of musical chairs scenario, because in a single crew operation, the captain has to be at the controls for takeoff and landing. So therefore, by inference, they are going to choose when they feel the most appropriate time is for their rest, because all of you need to be rested. There is an argument to say that the third person doesn't necessarily have to rest, because they would just go off duty before the flight ends. But sensibly, if all 3 of you take a rest period, then you've got 3 sets of eyes on the flight deck at the end, which always makes sense, really. Extra pair of eyes worth $1 million. Yeah. Typically, it's a bit like when it comes to choosing the crew meals. The captain will have first choice. Some captains I used to fly with used to like to take their rest straight away. Others would like to take it, further down the flight. And again, lots comes down to that. It's not just how you feel as an individual captain. It's also, you'll look at it and go, okay, well, there are certain complex bits of airspace that it's probably best if I'm around for, because if it goes wrong, we might get shot down. So,
good.
So, and that's how you would kind of play it. And we used to do it so all 3 of us would get some rest. You just go in one of the lie flat seats and have a little bit of a nap. Funnily enough, on the flight deck, I can think on less than one hand's worth the number of times I've actually slept on the flight deck.
Wow. Okay.
But put me in a seat in a cabin and I can go to sleep pretty quickly.
No time at all. So I mean, here in the UK, we adhere, from a driving perspective, we adhere to the EU rules and regulations when it comes to tacho hours and things like that. Now, I know that the rules are different in other parts of the world. But, I mean, I guess I'm assuming that the rules are the same for pilots across the board. No, you're absolutely right. The rules are different in various parts of the world. So all of Europe plays with the same rule book at the moment. And that includes the UK, even. That includes the UK. Yeah. And that aspect's not going to change quickly with Brexit. So there's a set framework. We used to have our own flight time limitations in the UK up until, maybe about 18 years ago, which was actually a bit more restrictive than what we have these days. The airlines didn't particularly like that because they felt that they weren't playing on a level playing field against some other countries in Europe. So there were some countries in Europe that had a kind of flag of convenience for flight time limitations. So from a commercial perspective, if the flight time limitations were less constraining, then it's cheaper to operate. But you're always playing that balance between safety and cost. And of course, the biggest cost is an accident. When we went to harmonise European flight time limitations, they became less rigorous, and there was a fair amount of uproar in the UK because we'd spent as pilots a long time working to try to get these things tweaked, because we were aware that you can only push the boundaries so far. I'm not saying that the current regulations are unsafe. I'm simply saying that they were better when we had our own in the UK from a pilot perspective. Okay. But within other parts of the world, so for example, in the UAE, they have their own way of doing things, their own rules. Australia has its own rules. America has its own rules. Canada has its own rules. And when I've spent a little bit of time looking at all of these frameworks, and they're all complicated, by the way. And when I say complicated, with regards to the flight time limitations, there are the rules and there's interpretation of the rules, because they're not necessarily categoric. There's more than one way of reading things. And
the rule makers don't necessarily give practical examples to indicate how they interpret it. So, different airlines within Europe have their own little way of operating. And then sitting on the top of that will be any sort of industrial agreements, so sort of scheduling agreements, if you like, that are locally negotiated between the company and its representatives or union. It's complex. I mean, I've been flying now for over 20 years, and I certainly don't know them as well as you would. You do know your driving ones.
No, indeed. Actually, and the final question on that, if I may, Al, is I know certainly as far as my rest is concerned as a professional driver, the amount of time that we're allowed to drive over various weekly periods, etc., is all based on how much rest we've had. So the key actually is to have had the appropriate amount of rest, and so you can borrow a little bit of rest from like next week, but it has to be given back to you. For an example, I mean, is it a similar system with pilots, or is there a limit, for example, to the amount of hours that you can fly in a year, as an example?
There are yearly limits. There are rolling 365-day limits. There are 28-day limits. There is a raft of limits for the number of hours that you have flown, duty, and it is, again, immensely complicated. And it can only really be tracked with,
an app,
yeah, or a fairly complicated Excel spreadsheet. And the crewing departments within airlines will also track this data as well, because there is an onus on them to ensure that they don't operate you when you're illegal to operate. And if you do breach the flight time limitations, you are conducting a criminal act.
Right.
So in the same way as you would be if you breached your driving limitation.
And is that the responsibility of the pilot or of the operator to make sure that you don't break those rules, or is it a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B?
The ultimate responsibility is on the individual.
Right.
So the individual is responsible for ensuring that they do not operate when they shouldn't.
Okay.
The operator has a duty of care, is probably the best way of putting it, where they should ensure that they don't require you to operate, but ultimately it's your responsibility.
Wow. Okay. Well, as always, Al, it's a fascinating subject, and I know we've only just scratched the surface, but for now, Captain Al, thank you.
It's a pleasure.
If you'd like to watch more from our great series, then you can do that by pressing here. We've also created you a playlist with all the Plain Truth episodes, and you'll find that just here. Why not like and subscribe to our channel? That way you will be notified whenever we post our great content. Or if you've got a question that you'd like Captain Al to answer, then why not pop it in the comments box below, and you may well feature on an upcoming episode of The Plain Truth.